Good morning, afternoon, or night, whichever it might be for y'all. It's morning for me, Saturday morning, July 1st. Everyone in my house is still asleep. So I came outside so I wouldn't bother them much. So we are going to read chapters 3 and 4, like it says on your packets, to read chapters 3 and 4 this week. And this is due on the 16th, this packet. When you come back, it will be week number 3. Hope you have your packets. Like I said last time I was explaining to you, let's always make sure that we read the last page of our packet before we start our reading so that we can know our questions and what we need to concentrate on while we're reading. Sometimes if we know what we have to write down or what we have to do for our reading assignment, as we're reading our chapters, we'll think about it and we'll think, oh, that was the answer to that question. So this one on 3rd and 4th grade, chapters 3 and 4, all you have is a couple of writing assignments. And this is just, it says journal entry number 2. I don't know why it says number 2. Probably because I didn't put number 1 in the packet. There's a bunch of these, and I don't want you guys to have to do these every single time. So we'll have some of these sometimes. On page, it even gives you the page if your book looks like this. And I think they all do. I'm not sure if they all look a little different or anything, but it even tells you what page to go to find the answer. And it's just asking a question about grandfather. Now we need complete sentences in this paragraph. It's a 2-part question, and it's asking your opinion of why you think what you think in this question. So 2 to 3 sentences, please. Every sentence starts with the capital letter and ends with punctuation, which is period. You guys should know this by now. Question mark, exclamation point. And then down at the bottom, it asks you a question about your own life, and to write a couple of sentences about this. Now, can we please put in our sentences at least 5 words per sentence? So, in capital letters and punctuation, and at least 2 to 3 sentences per. If there's not enough room on here, you guys can always get another sheet of paper and label it your journal entry or your reading assignment, and write on a regular piece of paper and just attach it to your packet, staple it, or paper clip it. Grade 4, you guys have the same thing on the back, but if you notice, you'll get to one before, and this is just a few more questions about cause and effect. You're always going to have a character's going to do something, or there's going to be an action. For every action, there's a reaction. For things that we do sometimes, there's always going to be something that's affected by it. It gives you an example of a cause, and then you write down your effect. Or up here, it gives you an example of an effect, and you write down the cause. For example, the house was filled with the smell of bread. That was the effect. That's what happened because of what? What made the house filled with the smell of bread? And then there's just some sentences at the bottom to complete, and it's pretty self-explanatory. So just these 2 pages. At the bottom, it'll say character traits for each character. What is a character trait? It means, what are they like? What is their personality? So that is for 3rd and 4th grade reading. Now let's get on. And always feel free to fast forward if you don't want to go over what we got to do for our questions. So I'm going to start with chapter 3, which starts on page 32. Now, what happened in the last 2 chapters? Do you guys remember? Right before we let off at chapter 2, Ellen had gone to get a bucket of water. She came back and realized that grandfather had fallen and hurt himself. Chapter 3, page 32. Ellen lugged her bucket up the steps and followed her grandfather into the shop. As he crossed the room and flopped down on his couch, he looked like a rooster with a broken leg whose top feathers had fallen over his beak. "This will make you more comfortable," Mother said, tucking a pillow under his head and spreading the wool blanket over him. "Best keep him off that foot for a while," said one of the carpenters. "I'll make a crutch for him and bring it round in a day or two." At that suggestion, Grandfather groaned. "No crutch! I won't use a crutch. I'll get well before you can make it." He pushed his wig off his head and ran his fingers through his short reddish hair. "Today of all days," he said. Mother thanked the carpenters for bringing him home and shut the door firmly after him. Then she walked to the door and blocked off the stairway to the bedrooms above and made sure it was shut, too. "Now don't excite yourself, Father," she whispered. "I know you'll think of something." "But they leave at 11, cried Grandfather. "Shh! Stay calm." Ellen wondered what was going on as she got an earthen pot from the cupboard. Grandfather seemed so worried, and there was the strange loaf of bread with the snuff box baked inside. She poured half the water from the bucket into the pot and brought it to her grandfather's couch. She watched him pull off his shoe and white stocking and wince as his foot hit the cold water. She picked up his wig that had fallen to the floor. Sitting down on the couch, there's some wasps out here. She picked up his wig and had fallen to the floor. Sitting down on the couch, she stroked his sandy red hair. It was hard to see Grandfather lying there, all disheveled, with his leg hanging over the side of the couch and his foot in a pot of water. He looked like Ezra. Ezra was always getting into some kind of trouble when he fell from a tree or got caught in a beaver trap. But Grandfather, he was the one who took care of everyone else. He put leeches on a bruise or cut a vein and let the blood flow out into a basin to cure an ailment. Everyone came to him with their troubles. Ellen hated to see him look worried. The freckles stood out on his ancient face as clearly as spots of rust. "Would you like some hot porridge, Grandfather?" she asked. "No, thank you, Ellen," said Grandfather without opening his eyes. "What time is it?" Ellen looked up at the little square clock. "It's 8 o'clock. Would you like some tea?" she asked eagerly. "I could take a few of the officers' tea leaves from the tea caddy." "No," Grandfather said again as he pulled his foot from the water and held it up to look at it. With a groan, he let it fall back on the couch. There was no doubt about it. The ankle was even bigger than when he first came home. If it were someone else's ankle, Grandfather would put the leeches to take out that swelling, Ellen thought. Now she knew what she had to do. She'd put the leeches on his ankle for him. She'd take the tongs and put those slimy leeches on his ankle, watching them slither around until they got a grip on the skin. Then she'd have to see them swell up while they sucked out the blood. She shuddered at the thought. Ugh. But she'd do anything to help Grandfather get better. Though it made her feel sick to think of it, she stood up and looked at the green glass jar on the counter. Once again, it seemed to her that the painted faces of the wig gentlemen were smirking at her beneath their big white wigs. "Pox on you," she said to them, although they hadn't really laughed at her. "I can make myself do it." Gingerly, she picked up the jar with both hands and turned to Grandfather, who lay with his eyes closed. "Look, Grandfather," she whispered, "I can help you. Take your foot out of the water and I'll put some leeches on it." Grandfather opened his eyes and smiled at her weakly. "Thank you, Ellie," he muttered, "but it isn't time for leeches yet. Later, when it's black and blue." He patted her waist. "That was kind of you." She put the jar back on the counter and hastily wiped her hands on her skirt. She saw how really tired Grandfather was and drew the curtains across the 2 front windows to shut out the noises of the street. Since that made the room dark, she gathered pine knots from the basket to start a fire in the small fireplace. Perhaps Grandfather would feel more cheerful when he could look at a bright fire across the room. As she sat down in the chair by the fire to eat the porridge her mother brought her, Ellen could see that Grandfather had dozed off with his arms across his face. He lay so still and quiet that the ticking of the clock sounded very loud in the room. In the street, she could hear the cracking of an old ox cart and then the quick jingling bells of a sleigh, but inside there was only silence. Suddenly, Grandfather cleared his throat and called out across, "Where's that boy Ezra? Didn't he come back to New York with you?" With her spoon halfway to her mouth, Ellen turned to stare at him. Had he forgotten about Ezra? He must be out of his head. "Ezra didn't come back with us," Ellen reminded. "He marched away with George Washington's army last fall. Don't you remember?" Grandfather clapped his hands on his head. "My brains are addled. Must be from all the fall on the ice. Must be from the fall on the ice." When at last Mother pulled the brown loaves from the oven, the whole house was filled with the smell of fresh baked bread. She brought the round loaf to show Grandfather what a fine, strong crust it had. To Ellen's surprise, Grandfather groaned again when he saw it. "Put it there on the shelf," he said. "But what's to be done now?" "But what's to be done now?" Ellen heard him whisper. "This message must get there tomorrow." "Couldn't your friend the cobbler take it for you?" Mother asked in a low voice. "He went last week, and they were suspicious of him." Ellen could see her mother's nervous hands playing with the scissors and the razors on the little table between the two chairs. "Perhaps maybe I could take it for you, Father," she said softly. "I could dress up as a man." "You'd fool no one but an idiot, Abby. You'd never get home again." Grandfather's fingers played up and down the row of brass buttons to the vest. "A barber is welcome anywhere. That's how I went through their lines before, with my shaving kit and my jar of leeches." So Grandfather must be some kind of spy, Ellen thought with alarm. There must be a message in that loaf of bread, and he must have planned to take it through the enemy lines. He had said something about leaving at 11. As she sat there, Ellen had the feeling that her grandfather was staring at her. She could almost feel his eyes go through her. "Ellen could take it for me," he said with decision. Ellen could not believe she had heard her grandfather correctly. He couldn't mean that he'd sent her through enemy lines as a spy. Mother sank down on one of the barber chairs by the counter and stared at him in a startled surprise. "A little girl to do a man's work? She's 10, isn't she? Almost 11. She's old enough." "But Father," Mother cried. She was almost stuttering in her hurry to object to Grandfather's idea. "It's too cold to go sailing across the bay in December. A little girl would freeze with only a shawl to wear." She clapped her hands to her brown hair and ruffled it with nervous fingers. "How could you think of a thing like that?" "Now don't get so upset, Abby," Grandfather whispered. "She could wear Ezra's clothes to keep warm. No one would notice a small boy with a loaf of bread." Quickly, Ellen looked from one to the other. Her mother wouldn't let him go with such a scheme so wild. Mother's blue eyes flashed. "But Ellen doesn't even look like a boy." "Shh," said Grandfather, pointing to the ceiling. "We could cut her hair like a boy's." He seemed rather pleased with the idea of the disguise. "Just like that," said Mother. "You expect me to cut my daughter's hair and send her off just like that? You forget, Father. I gave my husband to the cause of freedom, and my son has gone to the war, too. I won't send my little girl." Grandfather was surprised by this outburst. "But she isn't going to the war," he said gently. "All she has to do is cross over to Elizabethtown on an oysterman's boat and hand the loaf of bread to my friend Shannon and come home." Mother threw up her hands. "It's too dangerous," she protested. She set her mouth in a stubborn line as she shook her head. "It's too risky." Ellen looked from one to the other. Grandfather couldn't be serious about this. She couldn't pretend she was a boy. She was too small, and she wouldn't know how to act. Maybe someone like Dicey could do it. But Grandfather was looking at her. "I couldn't do it, Grandfather," she stammered. "Why, I don't even know where Elizabethtown is. I don't know Mr. Shannon. How could I find a man I don't know?" In her fright, she was tripping over her words. How could I go on an oysterman's boat by myself? Leaning on his elbow, Grandfather beckoned her to his couch. "Look, Ellen Toliver," he said quietly, "I won't send you off to do something that was dangerous. I love you too much for that. Now, it might take courage for you to sail across the bay, but it isn't dangerous." "But I know I'd be too scared to do a thing like that by myself," Ellen protested. "You know how scared I get. I can't do the hard things you tell me to do. You think I'm Ezra, but I'm not, Grandfather. I can't even stand up to Dicey." She hated to tell him that she had run away from Dicey again, in spite of all he had told her this morning. She kept her head down so he couldn't see her eyes. "I don't have the courage like other people, Ezra. Ezra says I haven't any at all." "I don't agree with you," said Grandfather. "You had courage when you and your mother walked 10 miles to New York," he reminded her. "And you had courage when you stayed all alone in your house with war all around you." Ellen nodded. "And today, when you brought the leeches to put on my ankle, that took courage, didn't it?" Well, yes, thought Ellen. That did take courage, but it wasn't the same as going across the bay, all able to do a place excuse me? Well, yes, thought Ellen. That did take courage, but it wasn't the same as going across the bay all alone to a place she'd never been before. "We get over fear," said Grandfather, "by doing things we cannot do." These are trying times, Ellen. Many people are doing things they thought they could never do. It was hard to think of an answer. Ellen stood twisting her fingers and wondering what to say. She thought if they made her go, she'd never get back again. So the definition of being brave is being afraid, but doing it anyway. So that is the end of chapter 3.